This is Joe Kopsick. It's April 8th, 2020, a couple days after the last time I made a coronavirus video. This is another one. This is a follow-up, a reaction to a video by Kyle Kulinski from Secular Talk, also known as the Kyle Kulinski Show, Secular Talk on YouTube. And the title of the video that I'm going to be reacting to and criticizing is Charlie Kirk, COVID Bailout Shows Medicare for All is Perfectly Affordable. Now, I want to say I have respect for the intellect of Kyle Kulinski and Charlie Kirk, and Kyle Kulinski is going to be criticizing Charlie Kirk. I'm going to be defending him from some, but not all of those criticisms, and I'm going to explain why, even though I respect Kyle Kulinski's intellect, I think he's showing his ignorance on economic topics a little bit, or if it's not ignorance, then I think it's motivated by wishful thinking. So here we go.
And Michael Knowles spoke about the Corona bailout bill. And what Charlie says here may surprise you. And I think there's a small chance that he would like to have these words back.
And they're already talking about another stimulus. And look, here's the long and short of it, is that middle America, real small business relief, the best stimulus they could have, Michael, is the green light to go back to work. I mean, that's what they want. And so I understand it's not that simple, and I understand there's, you know, all sorts of competing data and all that sort of stuff. However, I am of the opinion, like, hey, posting a $4 trillion deficit, that should be something that should be deliberated so thoughtfully and critiqued so carefully, not jammed through and passed in what I consider with some of the most egregious waste that I've seen in a bill in the history of the U.S.
And you know,
and notice he didn't specify what that waste is. And he doesn't say anything like we shouldn't spend money on poor people, shouldn't spend money housing the homeless who are outside in this crisis. He doesn't say specifically what he considers waste in this bill called the CARES Act, which is a potentially maybe even $14 trillion bailout / stimulus bill, depending on how you look at it. It could grow as big as $14 trillion. So yeah, naturally I agree with him and anyone else who says we need to consider that very carefully if we're going to post a $4 trillion deficit instead of the normal one that we usually do, which is still a horrible idea.
But what's so scary here for conservatives is the precedent. Because, listen, I'm fairly amenable to the bill. I can get behind a lot of aspects of it. But the sticking point for me...
You're more amenable than me, but finish.
I know, I'm probably more amenable to it than you are. But the sticking point for me is we are now setting the precedent of the government on a massive scale sending direct checks to people because of a time of crisis. Well, look, maybe this is a serious crisis, at least an economic one, but what about the next time?
Yeah, but Michael, I mean, Medicare for All costs $32 trillion, but not $32 trillion a year.
That's right.
That number that Bernie said was over 10 years. So now we've set a precedent that $3 trillion a year for Medicare for All is not that much.
Yeah.
In fact, it's perfectly affordable. But UBI, why not do it every quarter?
Why not?
Every month?
why not? I agree, Charlie. I agree.
Now here's something that they're not going to tell you. The whole point of UBI, at least an Andrew Yang style UBI, and the kind that was being floated and proposed over the years by, Sergeant Shriver, Nixon was going to blow it up and not do it exactly the same way others wanted to do it. But Andrew Yang's plan is to replace existing spending with a UBI. Send people their fucking tax money back instead of just adding government programs that are just more expensive on top of the UBI. They're not going to tell you that because that would stop excusing just as much spending as they feel like it, and it would undermine Kyle Kulinski's argument. His argument, which I have to take Charlie Kirk's side a little bit on this with, I agree in spirit with Kyle's criticism with, well, if we're spending $300 billion on this, why don't we spend $300 billion on that, or $3 trillion, or whatever the number is. So yeah, you could cut the military to pay for something else, like more health care. But that's sidestepping an important constitutional issue. There's an economic side of the issue, and there's a constitutional side. And he's totally neglecting and ignoring the constitutional side, and he's getting the economic part half right. So the reason we can't afford, well, we can afford it. We can afford Medicare for all, but I oppose it for now because it's unconstitutional, because there hasn't been an amendment to the Constitution saying that the federal government has the responsibility to create a national health care system. That doesn't exist. All the president's federal healthcare policy, all the federal government's healthcare authority is fake because it was handed over by Congress and the Supreme Court said it was okay when it was taken from the people illegitimately, or it was that the president was using presidential reorganizational authority to sweep whole sectors of the economy and industry, i.e. the health industry, into under his purview, and the Supreme Court and Congress just let it fly. So there's no authorization for the federal government to be involved in health care in almost any way, except if you refer to, like, health patents or the health care of federal workers. That's a very narrow scope, and people like Kyle Kulinski, they don't care about those limitations. They don't see how it's going to, eventually we're going to have a fascist government that just wants, I'm going to give everyone health care, or tell everyone I'm giving them health care, and buy complicity and send people money. That's what we have right now. Reagan administration, we put them in power, and look how bad they fucked up the AIDS crisis, the HIV crisis. They did nothing for years, and they realized, this is really serious. It's not worth it giving so much power to a federal or national government over your health care. Health and environment and land issues, and those are inherently local issues, in my opinion. But we could, is my point, we could afford a national health care system. It's just unconstitutional. And so are the bank and corporate and small business handouts and bailouts and stimulus that's going on right now. And that's what I think probably the primary thing that Charlie Kirk is concerned about, because that's what the overwhelming majority of the spending in the CARES Act is about. There's very little of it devoted to poor people, or else Jimmy Dore wouldn't be saying it does nothing for poor people, and AOC wouldn't be saying this is crumbs, we need more than crumbs, while voting for it.
Yeah, he's actually making our case there. He's making our case there. If you give him credit for anything, it's that at least he's being consistent with his own ideology, whereas many so-called conservatives or so-called libertarians, they act like government spending is wrong, growing the deficit and the debt is wrong, and then, when it's inconvenient, they totally flip on that, and they're like, yeah, I'm completely in favor of the debt and the deficit and increasing the government massively.
I have never heard a single time when Charlie Kirk, or someone I believe is actually libertarian, I've never heard them say that a deficit is okay, that debt is okay, that more national debt is okay, that deficit spending, they would never say that. The ones who would say that, yeah, I agree with Kyle, they're crony corporates who shouldn't be calling themselves free marketers or libertarians. They support small business handouts, crony corporate handouts, handouts to banks.
He says, well, listen, you've set the precedent now that we could just do whatever, that we could just pay for whatever, that it's not really a question. It's not really like, we have to tax to make sure we get every dollar and every cent for a spending program. You could just kind of do it. And it reminds me of what the clip that we played from the head of the Federal Reserve, and actually it was both heads of the Federal Reserve, one during the Great Recession, Ben Bernanke, and then the newer one, I think his name's Jerome Powell. And they said in no uncertain terms, yeah, we could kind of do whatever we want. And Ben Bernanke said, it's not, all we do is like move a decimal point on the screen at the Federal Reserve, and we just marked up the account, and then we're done. Now, I need you to understand something. This is under Democrats and under Republicans. This is under liberals and conservatives. This is the dominant philosophy, the dominant strain of thought in today's day and age. And it's like that for a good reason, because we've learned the lessons of history and what happens when you hit a giant economic crisis and you don't do that, and the government is not the spender of last resort.
Excuse me, but when has the government ever not done that? When has there been a time where the government's like, there's an economic crisis, there's a recession, there's a depression, let's do nothing? There's only one time I can ever think of when that's been done. It's in the 1921 economic crisis, or 20 or something, or 1919, when Woodrow Wilson had a stroke and his wife was basically in charge, basically president, and he couldn't do anything to respond to, inflate the economy or keep bubbles going because he had a stroke and he was basically paralyzed. that is the only time when government hasn't tried doing something. And every time the government has done something to respond to an economic crisis, it's made it worse. So the reason we can afford national health care, but the reasons we don't do it is because A, it's unconstitutional, not that everyone cares about that, B, it's expensive. Now, we could spend the money on Medicare for all instead of military. We could do that. But we can't afford a basic income at the same time because that would require returning money to the people. So what Kyle's saying here, he's making a very valid point that the chairman of the Fed say you can just inflate money or you can create money at will. It's just changing a decimal point in a computer bank somewhere. It doesn't necessarily affect inflation. And you can keep inflation under control while printing out a bunch of money. Now, you can say that, I mean, yeah, that is true. The government can make as much money in a computer or print it as much as they want. They do that to shore up the deficit. And he's missing the point. It's like, oh, the problem is inflation. It's like, okay, if we have a debt or a deficit, but the real problem is inflation. It's like deficits cause inflation. When the government has a hole in their budget, that's what a deficit is, when you don't have enough money, enough tax revenue to cover the spending, the budget, they inflate the money, borrowing it from the Federal Reserve and the people and our future and your children, the next generation, or they borrow it from China or Japan or another one of our lenders, or they raise taxes. So those are the three things you can do to shore up a deficit problem, a budget hole. And Kyle doesn't really have his solution is tax the rich, but that's a flawed theory. I'll just continue.
You exacerbate the economic crisis. Now, I would agree with Charlie that where you are directing those resources to is massively important, and our government does not direct them to the right places. However, where I disagree with him is his underlying point is like, hey, maybe we shouldn't just, spend trillions of dollars like that. I would say we absolutely can do that, and we should do that. We just need to spend it in the right ways.
We can't do, we can, yeah, we can. But can doesn't mean should. We can make a bunch of money, to spend $1 or $2 trillion on Pentagon spending, blowing people up all over the world with troops in 165 countries and 800 to 1,000 overseas military bases when we should be keeping them 90 miles from our shores in peacetime. But we have the income tax, so we can do it, and that means we should do it. No, we fucking shouldn't. We shouldn't spend all the money we have plus money that we don't have. Kyle doesn't have a plan for what to tax. He knows who to tax, the people with the most money, but he doesn't have any reasoning for why they should be taxed. I say they should be taxed if, not because, if they're doing something wrong.
And what he alludes to at the end there, I've always said you should be bailing out the people when there's an economic crisis. Don't bail out the businesses. If anything, what should have happened with the businesses, and was...
Notice how he said, if anything. So if anything, in other words, if the big businesses are going to be bailed out, then why not bail out the people too? It's like, yeah, good point, because there should be equality. But if anything, it really reveals something. You don't have to bail out either of these motherfuckers. If you bail out the people and not the businesses, you know how the businesses are going to take that? They're going to say, oh, you're handing out welfare to poor people. Where's our bailout? And there will be some people who are saying, you got your bailout 12 years ago. You don't remember that? You've gotten consistent bailouts every fucking day since then. They're like, no, there has to be equality, and there has to be, there has to be a deal that benefits both sides. So the more you justify giving to the poor, the more businesses are just going to justify and ask and use as an excuse to ask for more money and more privileges that are paid for by, you guessed it, the poor, hardest working taxpayers. Barry Goldwater said it very clearly. A government big enough to give you everything you want is also powerful enough to take everything away. And that is what you're risking when you ask for welfare and handouts at a time like this. You're welcoming a $14 trillion massive bailout stimulus plan that is not affordable by any means.
This will really make Charlie's head explode, is temporary nationalization. Because what happens now is you give these private businesses trillions and trillions of dollars overall, billions per company respectively, or per industry, whatever you want to say, and then they're going to go bankrupt in a year or two because nobody's, like, if you're the cruise line industry, if you're the airline industry, great, you got bailed out. Well, guess what? Still nobody's flying, still nobody's going on your terrible cruise ship.
That's because no one can afford them, and they're unsafe. You know why airliners and Cheesecake Factory are going out of business? Because being around a whole bunch of people in a non-ventilated area is unsafe, and people can't afford to go to the Cheesecake Factory, and then Cheesecake Factory is like, oh, I can't pay my rent. I'm not going to pay my rent. So everyone's like, Cheesecake Factory's fucking revolutionary. It's like, I can't fucking afford their shitty, expensive food, just like I can't afford to go fly across the world. And it pollutes a bunch of people in the process, and I have to let a guy touch my dick on the way into the airport terminal. Fuck airliners. They deserve to lose money. They shouldn't be bailed out. Why is he supporting nationalization? He thinks that nationalization is socialism because the media fucking put those words together. Nationalization is nationalism. Socialization is socialism. If you socialize these companies, of course he thinks he's talking about socializing them. Instead of talking about bailing them out and nationalizing them temporarily, which is involved just letting, I mean, yeah, you get a little bit of democratic control, but it's all, the control is all partitioned off by politicians. There's no real popular control over it. And then it's still funded by the taxpayers. It's still got, the taxpayers are the one who foot the bill for if the company goes under, well, it's under that temporary nationalization. Have you ever thought of just revoking these companies' charters? You know, having all the cops and military who protect their properties, you know, just telling them, go home, put down your guns, you're all fired. Stop building them roads with taxpayer money, make these companies build their own damn roads. But no, you think we got to be part of a social contract because you think, I think that people like Kyle and other liberals and progressives might even be deluded enough into thinking that these supposed job creators, which the government just gives slush funds of fucking credit, this backed by our taxpayer money to, props them up forever. Businesses can live forever like zombies, and we can't. We die. Businesses live longer than us. This guy thinks there's a fucking social contract going on. He thinks that's equal. He thinks there's no other way to get jobs besides if the government hires people or if companies hire people. He thinks there's no way to get social welfare unless you tax businesses. Well, why don't you stop letting these businesses exist in the first place and thrive on the taxpayer dime and then bailing them out over and over again, thinking it's going to be more egalitarian every new time you bail it out? Why don't you just abolish the fucking government and stop giving the government, take away the government's ability to rescue companies that make bad decisions? And I know they're saying, oh, these airliners didn't make bad decisions. They got screwed because no one can travel. It's like, well, they're bailing out the airlines, and the senators are writing letters like, oh, please refund your customers. It's like, why don't you make that part of the deal? Or why don't you shut down the fucking airlines, take their charters away, make them not be corporations anymore, dismantle the states and federal Secretary of State's office so that no new LLCs or corporations can be created. Why am I more progressive than a progressive being a libertarian? Why am I more anti-corporate than a progressive being a libertarian? Because these guys don't want to risk dismantling the government because they think that's how they get their butter for their fucking bread from. Look up mutual aid societies and food not bombs. There's plenty of ways to get things to people who need them without sucking the government's fucking dick for it all the time.
So you're going to come right back to the government hat in hand in a couple of years asking for another bailout. Now, I agree that that's what's called moral hazard. That sets up a terrible incentive system where now they're always going to come back asking for more bailouts. But that's why, you know, again, I'm of the belief that if you temporarily nationalize the industry and the taxpayer is the owner of last resort, then when the economy gets going better and there's reason to believe that we're on the right path, then you could hand it back over to private hands.
Well, what if the economy is not going to get better? What happens then? He doesn't seem to have an answer for that. And he understands the idea of moral hazard when companies keep coming back to the government asking for bailouts, but you don't understand the moral hazard of what happens when the poor keep coming back to the government and asking for bailouts. The government will say, oh, you want another bailout? Well, you have to accept these terms and conditions in order to get that bailout. It's like, why do I have to accept these terms and conditions? Didn't I already get fucked over enough? Aren't those my terms and conditions? Haven't I accepted my fucking over by banks and landlords and bosses and politicians enough? No, the government says, you have to take more fucking in the ass if you want this $1,200 check.
But as of right now, and many other countries are doing this, if you temporarily nationalize certain industries, that's the only way you could weather the storm. It's the only way. Because again, you could bail people out. You could bail out certain industries and keep them afloat for a little bit. But in due time, they're going to go belly up again because the economy's grinding to a halt.
Maybe they deserve that.
What he was saying there, in sort of a tongue-in-cheek way, like, why not do this and this and this? My reaction is actually correct. Those are probably the only things we should be doing.
No, the only things we, if by that you mean the federal government, should be doing are money, mail, and military, and patents and piracy, and a couple other things. Roads is arguably not one of them. So the only thing we should be... It's funny. He's like, the only thing we should be doing. Okay, this only thing is all we're doing is a $14 trillion bailout. If that's like a blink of the eye, a two shakes of the lamb's tail, like you're a fucking idiot. And you're wrong to criticize Charlie Kirk because he's saying be very cautious if you run a $4 trillion deficit. Do you realize what that is? That would be $7 trillion of spending and $3 trillion of revenue. That's a 233% budget deficit, or 233% overspending. That's ridiculous. That would be catastrophic. And Kyle is just like, we have enough money to pay for poor people's health care. That means everything must be fine. You don't fucking know anything about taxes, Kyle.
So, and the idea that Michael Knowles says there, oh, now you're setting a precedent of the government sending direct checks to people. We've had that precedent for a long time. It's called Social Security.
Fair point.
So we set that precedent. We already set the...
But with Social Security, we pay into it. With this $1,200 bailout, we're paying our freedom forever. We're agreeing to let the banks have up to $14 trillion, and we're agreeing to continue to exist in this fascist society where they can just tell us to go home and they can tell us that we're not allowed to touch our own face and all this stupid shit.
The precedent that...
So the cost of it is your freedom. When you pay into Social Security, you pay taxes, but the new deal is that you pay your freedom. That's not a new deal that I can get behind.
The deficit is not necessarily a problem. Every modern economist will tell you the deficit is not necessarily a problem.
It's not necessarily a problem if you solve it. Do you have a way to solve it?
You can get some Austrians who say, the opposite, but everybody who's a Keynesian, but beyond that, everybody, and the acting ideology at the Federal Reserve is MMT, modern monetary theory. And all...
No, that's just the euphemism that you call it. The modus operandi at the Federal Reserve is Keynesianism. You're just choosing to call it modern monetary theory because it makes you sound more progressive, and it makes you, it lets you delude yourself with cognitive dissonance into thinking that the Federal Reserve Chairman is going to personally suck your dick and give you $1,000.
All of them will tell you the deficit is not necessarily the problem is inflation. So as long as we can control inflation, we can do as much deficit spending as we want, assuming we have control of our own currency. And thankfully here in the U.S. we do.
Now that surprised me when he said that. We have control over our own currency in a sense that no other country makes our currency for us, but we don't, the people don't have popular control or congressional control or market control over their currency because the right to make currency is monopolized by the Federal Reserve and the Department of the Treasury. We have limited control over our money supply. That is why we need to get budgets under control and deficits under control. Because there's nothing wrong with, like, Kyle says, why not, like, he criticized Charlie Kirk for saying, oh, why not have a basic income? And then Kyle's like, well, if you're going to say that, then why not have, yeah, why not? Why not bigger, more often basic income? So it's not good enough to have no reason why not to do something. You have to come up with a reason why you want to do something. Does the federal government do it better than the states? All right, do it. Can it be implemented constitutionally? Yes, great. Is it a temporary emergency measure that has a definite end and a sunset clause? No, good. Go ahead. These are all, you have to have standards, Kyle. You can't just spend all the money forever.
We have our own currency. So there's a lot of stuff there that's fascinating. Charlie says, well, the best stimulus is really to get people back to work. Yeah, but there's a pandemic. So they can't go back to work. That's the point.
Fair
so what do we do in the meantime? Well, the proposals that, are the clear ones, in my opinion. You freeze all the major bills. Put a total freeze on rent, mortgage, student loans, all the major ones.
Or we could abolish rent and interest by ending crony corporatism and ending usury. You know, profit, interest, and rent would not be sustainable, and corporations could not be built if we didn't have usury and a monopolistic state that could print its own currency unlimited and order people to buy its own stuff. They can buy up stuff. They can devalue your stuff. They can tax you as much as they want. They can order you to change your production. We don't have economic freedom because we have a short-term profit-oriented state. And you have to criticize the corporate nature of the economy and the state at the same time. And liberals and progressives they shy away from criticizing the state because they know that they don't want to admit or they don't realize how much the state enables the corporations and gives them their power in the first place. This is a problem of rent, interest, and profit. He's not criticizing those things, rent, interest, and profit, and basic things like the class system and the wage system, because he's not a real Marxist. And oddly enough, for some reason I am, even though I'm still a libertarian. He's afraid to fall out of the neoliberal, that Overton window. He doesn't want to be seen as a critic of the state. It's just like Sam Cedar. He's progressive, but to an extent.
And then give everybody a UBI check every single month, and they could use that to pay for the bills that are not frozen. So you basically press pause on the economy.
Why don't you press abolish on the economy, Kyle?
And in terms of the bailout bill, he and I would agree on the corporate side of the bailout bill. I would not bail out the corporations, but I would effectively do a bailout of the people. And the logic is, hey, when there's a crisis, the government has to act because they have to look out for, as the Constitution says, the general welfare of the American people.
The general welfare means the universal well-being. It means everyone has to benefit from government spending. And that's why corporations and banks and small businesses are being bailed out at the same time as the people, to maintain the illusion that it's an equal bailout for everyone. And liberals and progressives tend to overuse the phrase general welfare, and they use it to excuse spending on generally everything that benefits people's welfare, well-being. And that's not what that means.
So I would just flip that right on its head, just like Charlie alludes to there, and say, well, if there's a liquidity crisis, and if there's the financial industry immediately gets bailed out and gets $1 trillion a day in quantitative easing when there's a problem, why don't we view the health crisis as a crisis? So why can't you use the same mechanisms instead of $1 trillion a day to prop up the financial institutions in Wall Street? Why not spend the money for Medicare for all?
Because health isn't mentioned in the enumerated powers as federal powers of the Constitution, and banking and bankruptcy are. It's not just an economic and a moral thing. There's a Constitution. The Constitution exists for a reason. It's to stop our government from getting too big and telling us what to do.
Because in my opinion, having 45,000 to 68,000 people die every year because they don't have access to basic health care, there's your crisis. You want to know another crisis? About 500,000 homeless people. That's a crisis. So the government should be the last line of defense.
So you want to hand over more power to the federal government because you think they're going to use it to help homeless people and poor people and sick people. The same federal government that has troops in 165 countries, that's gone to war with 106 different times in the last 110 years over over Latin America and South America. A federal government that's routinely disregarded and shit on every treaty it's made with the tribes. A federal government that spied on its own allies a few years ago. That's the federal government that you expect to help poor and homeless and sick people? You're fucking stupid.
And even though he doesn't mean it, when he says it at the end there, I think he's correct. He's like, well, now, see, you've set a precedent, and the precedent is the government could just spend whatever, whenever they want, for whatever reason, and this sets up a problem. Well, it's only a problem because our government is corrupt, so they're spending the money in all the wrong ways. It would, if they weren't corrupt and they just spent the money on the actual crises, that'd be wonderful. That would be a thriving social democracy. So, almost, Charlie, almost. You were so close. So close. But he said it. He's like, well, if we could afford the this ridiculous bailout bill, well, why can't we afford Medicare for all? Well, why can't we afford UBI? Correct, Charlie. Correct.
He's only correct in a sarcastic way. The point he was making is that we can't afford any of this because we keep running a deficit every single year since the year 2000. We don't know how to finance our federal budgets. There's ways to fix it. Like, it's called Georgism, the single tax, land value taxation, but no one wants to do that because it would involve taxing the people who own the land, and like land speculators and banks and the government and land hoarders, including senators who own large amounts of land, BLMs, the Department of the Interior, the state BLMs. Nobody wants to tax that because they're afraid of what will happen when you tax the people who seem to make the most money. They make the most money because the government allows them to steal from their tenants and from their wage workers. And so this guy does not support a radical enough change. He doesn't understand that we can't afford any of this unless we find a way to fill that budget deficit without just inflating and borrowing. We can raise taxes, but we can raise taxes on some things and lower taxes on other things to make taxes more efficient. We don't have to just raise taxes. You see, if we raise taxes and if we fix that deficit, it's going to be good for one thing, making a balanced budget, moving towards a balanced budget, but it's bad for another thing because if we just use it as an excuse to spend more and do the same amount of deficit spending, then we'll have the same giant police state, the same big military-industrial complex, and more corporate and bank bailouts. And then people will say, oh, every once in a while we need a bailout for the poor. Well, then the poor will they'll get their bailout, and then they'll get fucked over for another 10 years, begging for a bailout the entire time. And then they'll get another bailout after 12 years. Meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of people have died from being sick, not having health insurance, being addicts, and not having a clean place to shoot up. There's mutual aid societies that operate across borders. You can look up the mutual aid box alarm system, Food Not Bombs, Doctors Without Borders. There's plenty of organizations that care about the rights of refugees and stateless people. Fascist nation-state governments and their welfare systems will never care about the rights of illegal immigrants. And that's why I'm glad that Jimmy Dore said that he supports illegal immigrants, undocumented immigrants, getting the welfare check. Now, of course, it'd be better for them to just be free. Like, they're basically treated like slaves and second-class citizens, not even citizens in this country. They're trapped in this country and expected to work. They contribute a lot more to the financial well-being of this country than they take, but they take a little welfare, so everyone's pissed off. Welfare systems, even if they go to illegal immigrants, they just buy complicity in the system. We don't need to have our complicity bought anymore. We need to get out in the streets and say, hey, we have the right to be here in the first place. You remember we're all being told to be home, so everyone's saying we need to be out in the streets. Like, well, we can't do that because there's a pandemic. It's like, well, you have to make a decision. Is it worth it? How much longer are we going to just let these bailouts go? Oh, bail out the rich. Oops, we got to bail out the poor. Oops, we got to bail out the rich again. Don't you notice patterns? Don't you notice that you're being trapped and baited and hunted? They're fattening you up so they can eat you. They're fattening you up so they can take your eggs and kidnap your children every few years, so they have more workers that they can fuck over and exploit and wring out for all their money and work them to the bone. Smash the state, and the corporate power will fall.